living history session with you, the legendary Scouter. We're in Frederick, Maryland. I, Bill Cass, will be doing the interviewing, and I'm just another old rundown ranger. We have two representatives of the World Scouting Museum here with us. It's Tuesday, September 19th, and the first question, Joe, is where and when did you join Boy Scouts?
Bill, first I'm delighted that you and your friends are here. I feel honored that you want this living history, and I'll be happy to discuss this, tell you what I know about my life history, especially of scouting.
That's a lot.
Bill, I grew up in the small town of Manchester, New York, western New York in the Finger Lakes region, a town of about 1,200 people. It was a railroad center. The Lehigh Valley Railroad came from Buffalo on to New York with a spur that went down to Pennsylvania in the coal country. 90% of our dads worked on the railroad. There was nothing in that town, no movie house. There were two grocery stores, two butchers, a hardware store, a post office, a couple of barber shops and food room, and that was it. No movie or anything. Fortunately, there was a man by the name of Ainsworth Bennett that was scoutmaster of a troop, Troop 39, which was a very lively troop. And I could hardly wait until I was 12 years of age to join that troop. And so I became a Boy Scout on March 12, 1924. I remember vividly going through, the meetings were every Monday evening. There were very few meetings I missed, except when I was sick, but I enjoyed scouting thoroughly. Our troop camped in the Adirondack Mountains for 2 weeks, and I camped with them for 6 summers. I was a tenderfoot scout in 24, and that's when I joined that troop.
Are any of the scouts from those days still alive?
I'm afraid they aren't. I had a very good friend who was a Cornell graduate, electrical engineering. He just passed away 2 years ago. I believe he's the last member of that troop that are still living.
Do you recall your most memorable merit badge?
Well, interesting you asked that. My first merit badge that I earned was firemanship. And interesting, the fire chief, one of the butchers of that town, the meat market, he was the fire chief, and I met down in the fire hall. And we passed a merit badge on firemanship. That was my first merit badge. And that's when he asked me, Joe, would you like to work for me in the meat market? And I said, I would like to. So I did 2 things there. I got my fireman merit badge, and I got a job as working in his meat market.
I know that you are an Eagle Scout. Could you tell me a little bit about the presentation of your Eagle Award?
Well, interesting, Bill. When I earned my Eagle, and I recall my scoutmaster, Ainsworth Bennett, saying, Joe, we're going to Geneva. And he mentioned, I guess, the chief scout executive, but didn't mean a thing to me at the time. He said, there's a man there going to present you your Eagle badge. So he took me to the headquarters of that Finger Lakes Council. And I remember being on the stage with 6 other Eagle Scouts. And this man came out dressed in beautiful uniform with a cane. And he's the man that presented me my Eagle badge, Pin Eagle badge on me. It was not until later when I went to the professional training for Scout executives, when I met James E. West, that I said, my goodness, here's the man that presented me my Eagle badge.
How about that? Well, I think not long after you received your Eagle Award, you went off to college. Could you tell me a little bit about Cornell days and how you continued with scouting even though you were at school?
All right. Well, that's a short story, and I'll tell you it. I graduated in 1935. First, I'll tell you how I got into Cornell and how I got to forestry school. After I was 18 years of age, I worked on the railroad. Ab Hesney, who was a junior at Cornell University. And we sat in the curb across the street from his daddy's store. And I remember his asking me, Joe, what are you going to do now? I said, Ab, I do not know. He said, look, you love the outdoors. There's a wonderful forestry school at Cornell. You should apply. Well, I did apply. And I sent my resume, my transcript. I had to have another course, intermediate algebra. And I recall that the butcher's daughter needed some summer school. And the nearest summer school was Canandaigua, 7 miles away. And George Bushell, the butcher, loaned me the Model T Ford. And I drove that Model T Ford for those 6 or 7 days. Enjoyed it tremendously. And so I sent that transcript, history of that intermediate algebra. And then I was called in for an interview. And Bill, I remember this so vividly. I sat down with Professor Spring, the interviewing officer, a marvelous man who later went to Syracuse as dean of that forestry school. And I could tell that the class was overflowing. He had recruited too many. I wasn't having a chance. And finally he asked me the question, Joe, why do you want to be a forester? I looked at him and said, well, Professor Spring, I'm a Boy Scout. It was in a very fine troop in Manchester. We camped in the Adirondack Mountains for 2 weeks each summer for 6 summers. I fell in love with those mountains, and I thought, gee, it would be great to have a job in the forestry, and so I applied for the job, for the privilege of attending the forestry school. Well, interesting, the minute I said that, Professor Spring found a place for me in that crowded class. His son had just gotten his eagle, and he was the president of the council, a good friend of the Scout executive. So that's how I got in.
Well, you continued working in scouting when you were high above Cayuga's waters, too, didn't you?
Well, Depression years, coming from a poor family, I couldn't live up on the hill in a dormitory and whatnot. My dad arranged me to live with distant cousins in the west end of Ithaca. And so I lived there for 4 years. They had a son, Sam, who was 12 years of age, who was a Boy Scout. Well, he told his scoutmaster, who was not a scoutmaster really, he had no knowledge of scouting. He never was a scout. It was just a boys' club. He told Bob Leonard, the scoutmaster, said, you know, my cousin, Eagle Scout on the hill. And the next thing I knew, I went to the meeting, saw what it was. And pretty soon I joined his assistant scoutmaster. And what I did immediately was to organize that group of about 30 boys into 4 patrols. And I would take those patrols one at a time on hikes on weekends. Ken Spear was a scout executive. And Bill, back in those days, even scout executive, would plot the advancement of the various troops. And here in notes all of a sudden that Troop 25 had no advancement for a year. All 10 of us scouts, all of a sudden they became second class, first class, merit badge. So he decided to come down and see what happened. And that's when we met, in 1930. And that's when the idea, after I graduated from that with him, he's the man that put the idea of professional scouting in my mind.
I guess that idea stayed with you even into your first job in CCC. I've heard that of the hundreds of CCC camps across the country, there was only one that had a Boy Scout troop.
Well, Bill, I graduated from college, got my degree, and in 1935, I was employed in a CC camp in Frederick, Maryland, as a forester. And I spent from 1935 until 1938, when the state foresters, one of the first states in the country, I think one of the first 6 that had a state forester. And he said, Davis, I know you just got married. You're January. This was June. You've done a good job at Frederick, but we need you now at Meadow Mountain, Garrett County. It's the largest state forest that we have, and we'd like to have you go there. So I packed my dear wife of 6 months, and we moved to western Maryland, about 165 miles away. We couldn't find housing in Oakland, the county seat, so we found a little cottage on Deep Creek Lake, which had just been formed a couple of years previously. She lived there while I lived at the camp, and I would come home weekends. And during my years there, throughout my seas, I had the quarterly responsibility of interviewing young men as they came into the seas. I found their job, I discovered their job interest, they would tell me. And I tried to match their job interest with the job at the camp. It was good job training. And I'd always ask these young men, were you ever a scout? Now, in the beginning, the answer was, nah, these are dirty words. But as the seas continued in the 30s, latter part of 30s, we began to get high school graduates. And they could enroll, they could live in the outdoors, they could work in a healthy environment of the outdoors, and and they get $30 a month, $25 went to their homes, $5 spending money for the month. And I finally came across this young man that came by, Jeffrey Coleman, wore glasses, nice smile, a high school graduate, and he was interested in forestry. I said, well, Jeffrey, that's fine, I'm going to have you on my forestry crew. And so I put him on my forestry, but I said, were you ever a scout? He smiled and said, yes, sir, I'm a life scout. Well, I said, that's great, Jeffrey. But soon after I thought about it, I said, gee, in nice truth, to get life and not get that final eagle was almost a sin. So I worried about it, and so I decided to organize the troop around Jeffrey Coleman. I made the announcement in for the whole group. I had 40 young men, 17 to 24, that responded that wanted to be Boy Scouts. I know nothing about exploring. And so I organized that troop, as Jeffrey was senior patrol leader. We never met indoors. We always met outdoors. They came out, the job was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 o'clock, 4:30. I'd clean up, get ready, and I'd go to the cooking, and I said, cook, what's for dinner tonight? Well, we got pork chops, potatoes, beans. I said, this is my scout meeting night. So he knew to package up 5 packages of the food. And we would get together on the state private truck, drive to a campground that would get developed, and the 5 patrols would sit down, prepare their meals, get around, and sing songs, a campfire. And finally, Jeffrey Coleman finished up his eagle requirements. And we had an eagle ceremony right there in camp with the troop. The commanding officer came over, and I pinned the eagle badge on his uniform. Interesting, that was probably 1938. About 1966, I walked to the chapel, 2 young men in exploring uniform. I said, good morning, men. And one of them looked at me and said, it is you, isn't it? Jeffrey Coleman. He'd gone through the war. He went to Penn State, got a degree in forestry, and got also a master's degree. Was working for the Forest Service in California with Explorer Advisor and brought his explorer unit to Philmont.
Isn't that
Great
wonderful?
meeting.
Well, as World War II approached, the CCC was starting to wind down. And I know you made not a huge transition in your life, but you joined the professional scouting ranks. When and where was that?
Well, towards the end of 1940, I could tell that the war clouds were looming, and that the CCCs would end. I might have continued working for the Forestry Department of the state of Maryland, But as I said, meeting Ken Spear, we became friends in 1930. He went on to Wilmington, the Scout executive, and Rochester, and I would meet when we drive to Frederick to see Vi's parents, either there or to drive to Wilmington to have lunch with him. Joe, come on in. I said, sorry, I'm enjoying forestry. And when he went to Rochester in 1941, I drove up to see my parents, drove up to Rochester, had lunch with him. He said, Joe, we're desperate for men. Why don't you come in? So that's when I was interviewed in Pittsburgh at a national meeting and came into Scouting in 1942 as a professional.
Well, being located in Philadelphia, you must have very fond memories of Treasure Island and the Order of the Arrow.
Bill, I had the pleasure of first being assistant director at Treasure Island. I was in the experimental camp. I was a camp commissioner. And then the following year, in 1945, I directed Treasure Island Camp. And it's interesting how that name evolved. There were a group of men that came and looked at this island as a possible council camp. And one of them said, this is a veritable treasure island. And that's the name, so the name stuck, Treasure Island. So, yes, I took care of my ordeal in 1942. I got my brotherhood in 44. And at 46, I stood the vigil on a devil's tea table overlooking Treasure Island. So yes, I have fond memories of the Order of the Arrow. Of course, as you know, that's where the Order of the Arrow started.
You must
have
been acquainted with him.
I wish I had known him better. I had met him after he had retired, but I never knew him to the point where we were friends. But he was a great scouter, and the Order of the Arrow is a great memorial to him.
Shortly after the war, and I guess you were probably in the professional ranks for 3 or 4 years, you were a participant in Wood Badge. Could you tell us about those early Wood Badge courses?
I'll tell you first how I happened to get into it. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Our director of training, had been director of training for 3 years at Philadelphia. I had returned from a meeting with my chairman, Millard Glasfelter, who was the provost of Temple University. A wonderful man, enjoyed associating with him. And I came to the office, went to my desk, when Horace Kern, the Scout executive, came by and sat at my desk and said, Joe, William Hilcourt called. He'd like to have you join some kind of a training course at Philmont. He'd like to have you call him. Well, after he left, I wondered, what more training do I need? And I had high regard for Bill, so I called him. And he said, Joe, I'm organizing the first Wood Badge course. I'd like to have you join that group. That's the first time I heard the term Wood Badge. It was brand new. 90% of us scholars never heard of Wood Badge. So I went to, found out the appointed the date. We were supposed to be at Schiff Scout Reservation. And I was there at the appointed day. And 32 of us got together. The senior patrol leader, Joe Thomas, who was the director of international scouting. He was the first scout executive of Puerto Rico, by the way, and organized that council, but then he was the director of international scouting. But he organized us in patrols, and I was a member of the Fox Patrol. And then that evening for retreat, when the Scoutmaster got up and officially welcomed us. And here were some of the leading men in the national staff. William Lawrence, National Director of Training. William Mitchell, the Director of Cub Scouting. Joe Thomas, I mentioned, was the Senior Patrol Leader. Frank Braden came in for a couple of days, the National Director of Program in LA. So I knew it was something different. Well, it was different. Wood Badge training, I forget the details and whatnot, but I still remember the emotional buildup, the patrol spirit, the thrills I had when Bill, the Scoutmaster, got up and talked about the lives of these great men that started the movement. Bill is one of the high moments in my scouting career.
Well, just several years after that, you were involved with another wood badge. And I gather you were not a candidate, you were part of the staff. Could you tell us about that one?
I'm sorry, again.
You were on the next wood badge course, you were part of the staff.
Oh. Bill Hillcourt was, that first troop wood badge course was experimental. Bill Hillcourt had tried to get wood badge in from the early 40s. There was a change of administration. Several of the national men had taken it, went to England, took that wood badge, so he had allies. So the administration finally permitted him to have that experimental troop. So we were an experimental troop. They came and observed. They liked what they saw. So Bill was given permission to put the second wood badge at Philmont, the third back at Ship. And he called me and asked me if I'd be a senior patrol leader. And I said, of course I will. I was delighted to go there for the third wood badge and be his senior patrol leader.
Now, I remember doing a project for you in 1976. I wasn't actively involved in scouting then, but in the late 80s, I did get back into scouting. I went to the '89 Jamboree as director of the Souvenir Video Project. So I got to go all around the Jamboree. One of the most exciting events that I saw then was you and another gentleman walking up to the Brownsea Island exhibit, and it was you and Bill Hillcourt. So I guess you met Bill before the wood badge, your first wood badge experience.
I was very fortunate. Philadelphia was a great council back in those years, with wonderful, outstanding volunteers. And I was fortunate to be employed there as a district executive. Back in those years, there were directors of camping who didn't want anything else but camping. They weren't interested in becoming scout executives. They were camping men. Tom Cairns was the director of camping at Philadelphia. And there was a continuity of management of the camps. They were always in ship-shape condition. Tom Cairns and Bill Hillcourt became very good friends. And Tom Cairns was best man when Bill Hillcourt and Grace were married. So there was a link between Philadelphia and Ship, where Bill lived. And so I met Bill Hillcourt through Tom Cairns at Ship. We established a relationship there that later became a very friendly relationship.
Well, you and I renewed our friendship at the '89 Jamboree. How many Jamborees have you been to? Have you been to all of the American Jamborees?
Bill, I have not. When I was at Philmont, I didn't have time to go. My first Jamboree was at Valley Forge. I was one of 4 national program coordinators. And I remember that Jamboree. It made an indelible impression on me. The thing I remember, there were 50,000 scouts there, and that beautiful sight. And then the evening of the opening ceremony, and I stood on the hillside and saw these columns of scouts coming in. It was really thrilling. And to know that the 50,000 came to the arena, and they were last scout seated at 5 minutes to 8 when the time to open the ceremony was 8 o'clock. It was timed beautifully. But that's an indelible impression I had. I attended the Jamboree, the World Jamboree, now I go on the lake. I attended the World Jamboree in Australia. I attended I didn't go to California, I was at Philmont when they had the 2 Jamborees, one at Idaho, one at Pennsylvania. So I did attend the Jamboree, the recent Jamboree at AP Hill, several of them there at AP Hill. But I did not attend all of them.
I know the last one was very memorable because you received the Philmont Silver Sage Award at that one. And we'll come back and revisit that a little bit later in this interview. We're going to talk a little bit about some Chief Scout executives. One that's very memorable to me, although I never met him personally, was H. Roe Bartle. Did you ever meet Roe Bartle?
I think everybody in the movement knew Roe Bartle. He was a very sought-after speaker at our national conferences and the Scout groups together. He was a big man with a powerful voice. When he'd get up, he'd say, if the microphone was in front of me, he said, "Get that away from here. The good Lord wired me for sound." So, yes, I knew him. He was a very good friend of Skipper Wilson, who was my Scout executive in Washington after Ken Spear left. And so I got to know Roe Bartle through Skipper Wilson.
What other Scout executives are most memorable for you?
On the local scene, J. Harold Williams, Scout executive of Rhode Island, was we brought him in for a speaker at our potluck dinners in Washington. And he was a great Scout and a fine speaker. I remember those early Scout executives, Amos Shields in Detroit. There were others that could come to mind, but back in the 40s, there were Scout executives that would be in local councils for 8, 10, 15, 20 years. And so there was a continuity there. So there were Scout executives. Ken Spear, whom I worked for, was an excellent Scout executive. Skipper Wilson started in Terre Haute, Indiana, went on to Evansville, became Scout executive in Indianapolis, and finally came to Washington. Later selected as personnel director. So there were a lot of memorable men, if I recall, back in those years.
How about Chief Scout executives?
James E. West had just retired in the early 40s. Interesting, he didn't want to retire, but he was 65 and the requirement was to retire, so he thought after he left that the Boy Scouts would crumble and fall apart, but they kept going. His successor was Albert Fretwell, who was the president of Teachers College at Columbia University. And there was quite a contrast there. I remember Joe Brunton very well. I think Joe Brinton was a very good Scout executive at Westchester. Joe Brinton and Brunton were very good friends.
Well, speaking of Westchester,
Yeah.
you were in a neighboring council. Do you have any recollections of other Chester County council executives and our Horseshoe Scout Reservation?
Bill, I remember very well the Scout executive of Westchester back in those early years, Lou Lester and Helen Lester. In fact, we became well acquainted. Unfortunately, and I've always wanted to see Horseshoe, I never got to see it. Maybe next time I visit Westchester, you may take me there.
We will take care of that. You can be assured.
I know it's a great camp.
Well, you went from Philadelphia to Washington. What did you do at National Capital Area Council?
Well, that's an interesting sideline. I had 7 years in Philadelphia. Ken Spear had lost his assistant, #1 assistant. They called him Deputy Scout Executive back in those years. And I was brought in for an interview with a couple of Scout executives, many from the national staff. And finally, after a month, he did call me and offer me the job. I called the Scout executive who was on vacation at Atlantic City area. He said, Ken Spears offered me the job as Assistant Scout Executive, Deputy Scout Executive. Joe, he said, drop in to see Dr. Boyer first. Dr. Boyer was the president of the Philadelphia Council, assistant superintendent of schools, right next door. So I dropped in and saw Dr. Boyer. And I said, Dr. Boyer, I'm leaving you. I got been offered a job in Washington as a deputy scout executive, an assistant executive, and I'm leaving 30 days. And, Joe, he said, isn't that where they decimated the staff? I said, yes. I understand the scout executive had to relieve about 7 of his 18 district executives as when he left. But I have confidence in the scout executive. I think he'll make it. Well, interesting, Dr. Boyer said, Joe, if we had the money to match or even surpass what they're offering you, I wouldn't do it. I think it is good for you to go for another experience. I wish I had in my younger days at the school administration. He had been second man too long and knew the value of moving on. Well, I moved to Washington, and I was Ken Spears' assistant. We had 11 district executives. There was no other layer. The scout executive, Joe Davis, assistant scout executive, 11 men. And I had responsibility of supervising the 11 men and creating the council activities, working with them. Each district executive had a council committee to work with. Jay Willett, Scout Executive Western District, had training. Don Simpson and Frederick had advancement and so on. So I had a wonderful experience in administration. Ken Spear was a great administrator.
I know that you went to Roanoke after Washington to the Blue Ridge Council. Could you tell us about those days and a little bit about how Camp Powhatan came into existence and its legacy?
I must say, Bill, that as I look back on it, I was extremely fortunate in the positions that I moved into. I moved from Washington to Roanoke. A wonderful council, small council, only had a staff of 9 men, maybe 10. It extended from north, I forget the county, all the way down almost to the Tennessee line, and west to Martinsville, which is the furniture center with Bassett, American Furniture, Lane, and so on. It was a wonderful council. The original camp of Blue Ridge was at National Ridge. Before I got there, the Scout Executive had sold that property and leased 400 acres in a mountain owned by Radford College. And they had just built, created the first Camp Powhatan, a lake, campsites, dining hall, and so on. And when I was there, we opened up that camp for the first time, Camp Powhatan. Well, that camp served well for a couple of years. We had on our staff Charlie Martin, the president of Radford College. Then Radford College was the women's division of VPI. The men went to VPI, Virginia Polytechnic Institute, and the women went to Radford. And the president came to me about 6 months after I got there. He said, Joe, I have permission to sell the mountain. And the Boy Scouts should have it. And of course, our camp was in that mountain. And I felt that we should have that mountain. And as an old forester, I was thrilled the idea of buying an entire mountain. So I recall that I went there, I got, to get the night, I really got the president, N.W. Kelly, excited about having this mountain. The supervisor of the George Washington National Forest, I knew him, his son was on my camp staff. He was a good scout. And I had, the engineering firm had a plane, and I had the supervisor of the National Forest, and I took a flight over the mountain, and he came and talked to the board about this beautiful campsite, this beautiful mountain. So we finally, of course, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Virginia Tech and Radford were part of the system. So it was a closed bid. We knew that there was an Isaac Walton League in West Virginia that had their eyes on this mountain. And Ted Dalton, who was instrumental in the Radford College getting that property, felt we should bid maybe $35,000. But we feared that Isaac Walton League and our board finally decided to put a bid in for $56,000. And we got the property. 15,000 acres, a farm on one end, another farm on the other end, for $56,000. And that was the beginning of the Camp Powell plan of today. I'm delighted that the succeeding executives now left there in 1960, but they have developed a beautiful high adventure program at that Camp Powell. And they camp about 10,000 a year, which is a great number.
Well, the story I heard, and I believe it to be absolutely true, that there was one prime mover on the fundraising that got that money, and that prime mover was Joe Davis. And for any of our listeners to this tape, that is now High Knoll Trail, New River Adventure. It's the second highest acreage in scouting after Philmont, so that was quite an achievement. Now, as a youngster, I went to the 1960 Jamboree, and I came back through Chicago. I remember vividly somebody from the Chicago professional staff was our guide and our escort through Chicago. I wonder if that was you. And
I'm sorry, it wasn't. I wish it were, but
well, you must have done something else good in Chicago. Could you tell us about the Chicago days?
Well, in 1960, Skipper Wilson then was personnel director. He talked to me about the need. There was a new scout executive at Washington, in Chicago, Alden Barber, who came from California. Skipper Wilson said he is really a great executive. His predecessor never had any council activities. Alden would like very much to have you come to Chicago and organize a series of council activities. As I say, the previous executive didn't believe in council activities. And here was a council that went, I guess he left it there. He was scout executive for 25 years or longer. They never had any council activity. So I went there as the activities director, developing a series of council activities. It was virgin ground, and really it was quite exciting developing the first Eagle Scout dinner. Now, these are commonplace today. But the first one that Chicago had had, and the council scout fairs, where we had this exhibition in the stockyards, and the council camp. I had visions of a council-wide camporee along the lakefront in Chicago, but that didn't work out. We decided to have four. We had, I think, 24 districts. We decided to have 4 area camporees. And I recall meeting with the committee, and I said it would be wonderful if we get a personality and hop in a plane and hop from one camporee to the other. And we might be able to get a military craft to do that. They thought the idea was great. So we tried to get a military craft. And I came back and said, sorry, man, we didn't work it out with the military. They said, how much will it cost to hire a plane or a helicopter? A plane. And I discovered that a certain amount of money, $500 perhaps, for a day, they said, we'll underwrite So we had Bill Hillcourt and the Council Cambrine chairman. And we had it publicized, where they would fly into each of these four segments, four campuses, land. And so Bill said it was one of his great experiences. The land and the scouts would just rush together and greet these arrivals. Yes, Bill, I thoroughly enjoyed my 5 years in Chicago. Incidentally, as I say this, apparently in the beginning, number 7 was a good number for me. I worked for the CCCs, the Forest Service, from 1935 to 42, 7 years. I went to the 77th National Training School for Scout Executives. I was in Philadelphia from 1942 until 49, 7 years. I went to Washington at 49 and 56, 7 years. Then the spell broke. In Roanoke, I was there from 1956 until 60, in Chicago from 60 until 65, and then as you know, Philmont.
Well, 1965 was the year that Philmont changed forever, or so think a lot of us. Can you tell us how you became director of camping at Philmont and what your first major challenges were?
Again, Bill, it's what you know is not important. It's who you know. Skipper Junker, my predecessor, who was only there for a couple of years, had a brain tumor surgery in Albuquerque, died in April of 1965. Skipper Wilson had just moved into the position of personnel director. He called me and asked me if I would be interested in going to Philmont as director of camping. At the time, I was not interested. I had done the job in Chicago. I was ready to go into another council. We had talked about some very major councils coming up. Skipper finally said, Joe, I want you to go there, and the Boy Scouts want you to go there. I said, sounds like a command performance. He said, well, it is. So I accepted the position. And I went to Philmont. And Bill, that first year, we had baptism of fire. I had a baptism of flood. I'd been there, got there in April, went through May. In June, we started gathering staff. We had a staff at that year of 300. Went through staff training. It rained every day. The soil on the ground was saturated, super saturated. And on June 18th, we had one of those historic flash floods. It was devastating. And here we're just there a couple months. The manager, who would ordinarily have taken it over, had gone with we had the Operation Scatter the day before. And so he went to Beaubien with the group. And so we had Operation Scatter with the 23 camp directors and staffs in their respective camps. When the sky opened up and we had this 12 inches rain in just a few hours. 12 inches is the amount of moisture that normally Philmont has each year. So you can imagine. And I understand now flash floods. It comes like a flash, it does its damage, it's gone. Well, we worked late that night. I recall so vividly Mike Hope, the director, our controller, in the ranch office, called me up at 4 o'clock and said, Joe, the river is rising, going towards the housing. we better evacuate the home. My poor wife, who'd been there just a month, she had 28 wives and children in a house they were trying to take care of. While the men folks, we all worked late that evening. The next morning, well, there was at about 7 o'clock, the horseman with his couple of wranglers took a pickup going on to Maxwell to Great Auto to take care of the horses. The bridge at the camping headquarters in Uraka had been washed out. And the fog and whatnot didn't see that, and they fell into that river bed. The only damage, fortunately, the driver did break his arm, the horseman. But later on that morning, maybe around 7:30, Charlie Rosenfield and I walked up to the reservoir. And Bill, that was a shambles. The dam had washed out. The reservoir itself was filled with boulders and stumps and whole trees. It was a sorry mess. And I felt, you can't run a camp without water. I felt that we'd have to cancel the operation for the summer. But Taciturn Charlie Rosenfield, who was the superintendent of maintenance, hadn't spoken a word. We looked at devastation. We walked down about 50 yards along the creek. We looked up at the filtration plant, and the first words he uttered was, "Give me a week and I'll have it in operation." What he did was to build a coffer dam that had water and had it piped up the filtration plant. And a week later, we had it in operation. We had everybody working at to restore, and it was a miraculous recovery from that. The Rangers, I fell in love with the Rangers. Bill Wadsworth, National Director of High Adventure, took the Rangers. Each had 3 or 4 groups. Each had their walkie-talkie, and they went through the flood area, repairing trails, reporting back, and Paul Felty, Director of Control, sat at the control center from morning until night. We brought his lunch to him. He had the large map of Philmont, and he sketched reports as the Rangers reported back to him. And those Rangers, bless their heart, they would work hard all day. We assembled in the dining hall that evening. They'd come in singing their Ranger song. Their spirit was tremendous, and it inspired all of us. So together with the Philmont staff, and I learned to love the staff there. They worked hard to restore. The permanent staff and my professional colleagues, working together, we recovered, were able to operate 7 days later. Instead of June 18, we opened up camp on June 25th.
Well, after the 40 days and nights of rain, I know that their inspiring leader brought some innovations to Philmont. Could you look back on some of those innovations that are still in effect today, I might add?
Now, Bill, I'm giving credit for a lot of the innovation, but let me tell you. I had the key members of the staff, Nick Pizer, that group, about 4 of them. They were sector directors coordinating the work of the camps. And together, we worked things out. Many of these ideas came from the staff, but I thought they were good for the improvement. For example, coming by from Miners Park down, remember Lover's Leap Rock? There I saw 2 of my Rangers dangling a rope. I knew nothing about rock climbing, and I envisioned them falling down and killing themselves and calling up their poor mother and saying, "I'm sorry your sons have killed themselves." And I said to them, "Hey, you Rangers, stop in and see me when you come in." Well, they came in to see me, and they knew that a strong offense is a good defense. They said, "Mr. Davis, I know you thought that was dangerous, but we're rock climbers. And you should have this program at Philmont. Really. Immediately I began to think, yes, we should have it. I knew there was a rock climbing school in Colorado. I said, okay, will you men, young men, come back next year and head up to rock climbing? Yes. We go to the Colorado school for a week before. Yes. So that's how we got rock climbing. I had an assistant director of a program at that time, Joe Clay, and if you recall, there were a book on Foxfire that came out about that time, all about living history and natural. And Joe thought about having a camp with rugged miners or hunters they were backwoodsmen. And he had an idea that it would be well to have the black powder guns. He wrote to the gun manufacturers in Tennessee and got a contribution of 12 of the black powder muskets. We got the black powder. We included a conservation program. And one of the programs I'm very proud of, in 1968, I developed, it was my creation, the Kit Carson program. I remember before that, year before that, sitting down with Alden Barber, the chief at that time, who came to the ranch committee meeting. I told him I'd like to see him. He came to my home. And I said, Alden, I have an idea here for you to chew on. I said, we have the report to the nation where the 12 regions pick out their 12 outstanding Eagle Scouts. And you send them into Washington to meet the President of the United States when they give the report at the White House. They go to the Congress and meet their congressmen. They go to the Home Office, meet the Chief Scout Executive. There are only 12. But from the local councilors, there must be 150 top Eagle Scouts. Nothing is being done for them. I've got a program that I'd like to offer you. I'd like to offer these young men a scholarship to take the Kit Carson program, an outstanding Philmont program. I'd like to have the National Council subsidize it for 2 years. And after that, we'll make it pay for itself. He thought there and thought, Joe, that's a very good idea. I'll get the money. Go. And so we had the Kit Carson Men program. And Bill, I must say this, again, the idea was there. I wanted a super Philmont experience. I got 2 of the top rangers. Rusty Wells was one of my rangers, training rangers. He had taken the Outward Bound program. Alan Frierson, a young, enthusiastic young man who later became a pediatrician, a doctor. But these 2 young men, I got them together and I said, men, we have this new program. I want you to give your crews the superior experience of Philmont. Rusty Wells said, may I inject some of the outward bound features? I said, such as what? Well, putting in, for example, a gut buster, hiking 25 miles in 1 day, sleeping overnight by themselves and so on. I said, Rusty, you may inject them. And so the important thing is keep up the enthusiasm, because I want these young men who consider coming on the staff the following year, because they'll be key, great men for the staff. And so we started the Kit Carson Men program, and it worked. It was very popular, and as I said, in 2 years' time, it paid for itself. We could, and later on, when the Indians didn't like the name Kit Carson, the name was changed to Rialto Program, which is a good name, by the way. So I'm so glad that my successors have continued that program, and it's now continuing very well. You know Jim McGillivray. His 2 daughters went to Philmont and took the ground program. Laura, the middle age one, the middle of the three girls, became a ranger. Holly was there this year at working at Clark's Fork. Very enthusiastic scouting. So it is, as I say, I'm proud of that program. It's working.
You mentioned another innovation, that is young ladies on staff. That's a Joe Davis.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I just started earlier. In 1972, the exploring program went co-ed. And I recall vividly being sitting in my office about May 1972 and reflecting, and I said, Davis, it's here. You might as well start hiring females. Well, I guess I must have sensed it was coming. There were two young ladies that sisters of the male members, their brothers were members of staff. There was Kathy Leach, whose brother Jim, Bill, and Mickey, all three of them were on the staff at Philmont. And there was Nancy Wells, the sister of Rusty Wells. And Nancy, she'd write to me from the time she was 16, applying. And I remember writing back to her, Dear Nancy, not yet. And next year I have no letter from Nancy. Well, in '72, I found out where Kathy Leach was in Albuquerque. She had graduated from college, was in her first job. I got her telephone number from her parents, and I called her. Oh, Mr. And I offered her the position on the staff. Oh, Mr. Davis, I don't know what to do. Let me talk with my parents. I said, Kathy, do that. And call me in the morning. Or call me after you talk to her. Okay. I called Nancy's dad in Denver, got her number. She was a junior in wildlife biology at the University of Montana. And I called her. She answered the phone. I said, Nancy, are you ready to come on the staff at Philmont? Are you kidding? No, I'm not kidding. I'll be there. So I had these two outstanding young ladies, Kathy Leach and Nancy Wells, for my first members, female members. And of course, as you know, we all know, girls have come into this exploring program in great numbers. And the Philmont staff now is including maybe a third of the staff are female. And you know what? They're just as enthusiastic about Philmont as the young men are.
Right. We all have a favorite place at Philmont. Mine happens to be Trail Peak and Beaubien and Abreu. What are your favorite places at Philmont? Or are they all your favorites?
Again, I'm sorry I didn't hear that.
What are your favorite places at Philmont? Where do you like to spend time at Philmont?
Oh, Bill. My mind quickly goes to Beaubien. It really is a beautiful setting. I've always liked Beaubien. Of course, the whole ranch is so different from north to south and so on. But all of them have their individual beauties. The ruggedness of the north country, the heavily timbered areas in the south, the streams down south. I always had great admiration for Wade Phillips and that Phillips Lodge at Fish Camp. And Fish Camp itself, that location, it's a magnificent location. And the beauty of it is not there perhaps, but I certainly have fond memories of O'Neill. The original Phil Tern Rocky Mountain Scamp started in 1938. opened up Baldy Town for the first. And that, sitting up there on that 10,000 feet, or almost 9,000 feet, and looking down Ute Valley, that is a magnificent sight there. So I say, Philmont itself, varied degrees of differences and whatnot, but various degrees of beauty also. So the whole Philmont Range is a beautiful chunk of real estate in America. And I'll tell you this, I think when history is written 50 or 100 years ago, that gift that Wade Phillips made, with the ongoing use of Philmont and the popularity of it, will go down in history as one of the finest gifts to the nation.
You're right. There are a number of images I have in my mind about Philmont and pictures of people, and one of my favorite pictures is you in your red jacket with your pipe in hand. There's another one of Joe Davis standing on top of Baldy Mountain. When was the last time you climbed Baldy Mountain, and how old were you?
That probably was the year before I departed, probably 74. And 74, born 1912, that would be what, 60? Let me see.
Be 62, and that's some pretty impressive hiking for a young man.
And I remember the occasion. Leo Wilhelm, the great scouter from Columbus, Ohio, who later became professional for a few years, who used to accompany me on promotional trips in Ohio. There was a church service going on at the top of Baldy. And he and I started from Baldy Town, climbing up, and he had all that photographic equipment, probably about 35 pounds carrying. And we walked up, we got along very well until we got up there to where the shale began. And I remember just crawling up there almost. We finally got on top of the Baldy Town. The church service was over. But that small group was finished up. In the meanwhile, a larger group came up, the hikers. And so there was another church service. And so my photographer had a chance to have a photograph taken of that church service on top of Baldy Mountain. And I have a confession to make. After the service, it was a communion service. There was the bread and wine. And the minister gave me the little vial that had the wine, and I drank that wine on top of Baldy Mountain.
Great story. I know that you've told Mark Anderson, the current director of program, that the director of program or director of camping is the very best job in all of scouting, and I think you're right. But like a lot of things, things do come to an end, and I know that you left Philmont in 1975 after 10 years. Could you tell us something about your return to New Brunswick and what you did before your retirement?
Well, Bill, it was in 75 when the administration changed the management and put the man who was tending the ranch out the land to take care of the stock as manager. And I'm sorry to say there was a reason they wanted to do that. They felt that putting in a rancher, that Choke Phillips also a rancher, it would make Choke Phillips happy and the family happy, and that they would get more money for their family. It was a wrong choice. He was a small man. The first thing he did was to, well, anyhow, I knew that he and I were good friends, but with him as a manager, and I received a certain amount of popularity there, that it would not work so I decided to, my wife and I discussed it, to take pre-normal retirement. I called Scout Executive, the Chief Scout Executive, and told him my desires. Well, he, being very kind, felt I had 2 more years. He said, I don't want you to retire. I'd like to create a job for you here to promote all high adventure. And so I discussed it with my wife. And of course, like all good wives, whatever you want to do, Joe. And so I decided to accept the opportunity. I asked him for the privilege of living at Shift. They had a number of townhouses vacant. That my wife was not feeling well at the time. And that was permitted. So I had that 1 year, and probably a few months, of promoting all high adventure. And that was very interesting, but it was low-key compared to the excitement of 10 years of being right there where the action was.
Well, after your time in New Brunswick, you did retire to Frederick, Maryland. Could you tell us about your second career as a volunteer scouter in Frederick, Maryland?
Well, I met my wife during years of my forestry days here at the Frederick City Watershed. She was a native Frederictonian, came from the little town of Myersville. She and her 2 sisters were all 3 of them were nurses. And I met her as a result of one of my foremen being caught in a fire, one of the bad fires that we had in 1936. He was caught in a fire. He had blisters on his hand, knuckles he'd met. They were the worst blisters I've ever seen. I took him to the hospital that Saturday evening after we got the fire out. At the old hospital, I rang the bell to get in. And out comes this beautiful nurse in white, starch white uniform, the hat, auburn hair. And she was great. She took that Steve Boswell, my foreman, into her surgical room. And I remember her clipping the tops of those blisters. And I said, my gosh, I didn't learn that in first aid. You should go in there with a sterilized needle and drain it carefully. And here she clips the whole top. Then she soaks his hand in a sterilized salt solution. I said, how long will you be there? About an hour. So I dashed out, bought her a pound of candy. Not a pound of candy. Not 2 pounds. It was a 5 pound of Barbara Fritchie candy. I bought it for $1.25. And for being so kind, I presented to her. 2 years later, she became my wife. Well, she came from Frederick. And so I took her around the home. And then I thought it was time to bring her back to Frederick, so I retire in Frederick. She had a number of nephews and nieces. And the niece, the daughter of her youngest brother, Linda Sundergill, married a Jim Sundergill. And they were, at that time, had been married, I guess, 10 or 15 years. But they became not only nephew and niece, but became very dear friends. And upon my return back in 1978, I took them to, we went to Philmont, the 50th anniversary of Philtown. They were smitten with scouting, both came back and became volunteer scouters. We were very close, and I worked with Jim, became district commissioner a couple years later. But I think my primary volunteer effort there was working with and through the Sundergills, Jim and Linda Sundergill. In those early years, I still was very vigorous and active and so on. I did a lot of eagle presentations. usually, there's big thing here, as is I think in most troops. They have not only the ceremony, but they always have a buffet table, have some meals and suppers, whatnot. So I was involved in numerous Eagle presentations. I worked closely with the commissioner staff. I worked in the district committee. I served as a member and as chairman of the nominating committee of the district. I had Dr. Robert Broadbrook, a dentist, Eagle Scout, one of the report to the Nation Scouts. I had him on my committee. We had George Delaplane, the first distinguished Eagle Scout here. And the three of us were a committee selecting the district chairman, district commissioner. So that involved some time. So I think, as I look back on it, it was low key. I was here. I would attend meetings, be with them, associate with the scouts. We enjoyed each other. So I think it was a matter of being a part of the whole district operation. And primarily, as I say, with my niece and nephew. Bill, they added a professionalism to the volunteer effort. Linda, a nurse, and an excellent nurse, petite, but a human dynamo. Jim was worked for Bechtel Corporation, electrical engineer, made maybe 12, 15, 20 trips to Russia and Ukraine inspecting their nuclear plants. So they've added a bit of professionalism to their volunteer effort. They've been great volunteers, and I'm proud of them. So I guess that was my involvement with the district. Primarily, I did nothing with the council.
Well, I know they're very proud of you. I know that the city of Frederick values your services. It's maybe not widely known, but scouting has no corner on Joe Davis's time because Joe has been a very active volunteer with AARP, Meals on Wheels, the literacy program. So you've been a real citizen here in Frederick. And I know that the council has thought very highly of your services because Joe Davis is a Silver Beaver Scouter, the National Capital Area Council. You're a distinguished Eagle Scout, and you've also received the Philmont Staff Association's Silver Sage Award. Is there any one of these that means more to you than others, or are they all kind of special in their own way?
Still, I received these honors and awards, and it was heartwarming to receive them. It was heartwarming at the Jamboree, and Ned Gold developed a beautiful ceremony, presentation ceremony, the Chief Scout Executive, the ribbon around my neck, the presenting the Silver Sage Award. But the fact that that award came 30 years after I left Philmont, the award on recognizing my tenure there 30 years earlier was very heartwarming. And when I accepted on behalf of the staff, my first colleagues, and the permanent staff. Together we had 10 wonderful years.
Go ahead, Joe.
Again, Philadelphia. I put in 48, I received my vigil. I went for the first good badge course in 1948 in June. It surprised me very much. I went back, they asked me to go back at the council, annual council dinner at the Bellevue. Josh Wyatt, the district commissioner for Western District. He said had a bad ticker, bad heart. And this may be too much for him. Will you go back there, Joe, and keep him company until he's called? So I did that. Josh and I was back there, he finally called, and I sat waiting for the end of the ceremony. Then I heard more talking. I heard Manchester, New York. And my gosh, they're talking about me. And Bill, at that 6 years after I was in the movement in Philadelphia, they honored me with the Philadelphia Distinguished Scholars Award. The third ever presented, and the first to a professional. I was quite touched by that. But from the awards, I appreciate them. They're part of the high events of my life. I treasure those moments when I got them, and I appreciate them very much.
Well, it was an honor for me to introduce you at Philmont. I know that your knee surgery prevented you from going to Philmont to receive the award. So it's a real pleasure to introduce you in absentia.
Well, Bill, they didn't have the right award at Jamboree, but they did have a replica or something that they printed out. I didn't get the real Silver Sage Award until you came to Frederick and came to our district annual dinner. And you presented me my Silver Sage Award.
Well, it's a real...
That I appreciate very much.
It was a real pleasure. Now, I understand that you're not the only Eagle Scout in your family. You have one or two grandsons. Do I understand that they're Eagle Scouts?
Well, as Jack Fire told you, he was too close to scouting. And he was a scouting during those war years when there was no continuity of Scout masters. There must have been St. Luke's Lutheran Church. There must have been in those few years 4, 5, 6 different Scout masters. Jack and Roanoke, when he was in high school, did serve on the camp staff. He was a Clark's director and served on the camp staff a couple of years. I always regretted that he didn't continue and become an Eagle Scout. I regret that his 2 sons never were exposed to scouting. And I think it's their loss. It's too bad.
Joe, pretty soon you're going to be 100 years old. That's not too many years away. So what I want to know is when and where is the party, and are we invited?
Bill, I am extremely grateful that I'm still able to move, to enjoy lunch with you and your friends. I am grateful that I can go to the Y every Monday, Wednesday, Friday and work on those machines, do great exercising. This morning I walked up a half mile and back without the use of my cane. I was proud of that. I do not know how many more years the good Lord has in store for me. But I'll tell you this. If and when I reach 100, you and Rob and Rich will be among the first to be invited.
Thank you.
I want to say I have enjoyed so much your being here with your friends. It has been an extreme pleasure. You guys are just great.
I know you're going to say great, and you're great too, Mr. Davis.